morning, everyone. My name is Jonelle. I'm the Education Director here at the Kickapoo Valley Reserve, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to our Driftless Dialogue talk. I'm just going to pull up Janice's bio here so I make sure I get it right. But we are honored to have Janice Rice here with us today. Janice is a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation and a retired librarian with a focus on American Indian resources, literature, culture, history, language preservation, and revitalization. So she has a wonderful talk planned for us today, and we do these talks once a month. They are, we call them the Ralph Nuzum Lecture Series or Driftless Dialogue, and they are free thanks to a grant from the Ralph Nuzum Kickapoo Reforestation Fund through the UW-Madison in connection and supported by the Friends of the Reserve and Badger Talks. So we do these once a month. We'll have one in November as well. And I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague, Summer Willis. She sets these up for us. So if you have suggestions or ideas for future talks, certainly stop and have a chat with Summer because she sets these up on a monthly basis for us. So we don't have the November one lined up yet, but we will soon, so keep an eye on our website for that. Restrooms are beyond the front desk there. There's refreshments out here in the lobby. And thank you all for coming, and welcome to Janice Rice.
Hijakishana hinikaragiwit. Ho-Chunk Raja hinukijawe gahingaire. Maichade Raja hinuk Janice Rice hingaire. Dejo regi egi de eja hachi hajate. Egi hunch hikikarat hija waunakshana waunjate. Hanija chawira haipin, rajiwira haipin. I just wanted to say thank you this morning and greeted you this morning in my native Ho-Chunk language. And I told you in my native language that my name is Janice Rice. However, my Ho-Chunk name is Hinukijawi, which means changing seasons woman. And I'm a member of the Bear Clan. And I'm really happy to be here today. I enjoyed my drive up here. It's so beautiful, and haven't been here in years. So I want to say thank you to the planners of this program for inviting me to be a part of the program series that you have. And it's so beautiful here. I feel like, like coming home. That's what it felt like to me, all the beauty and the leaves and the colors and everything. So I'm really glad to be here today. Just to give you an overview of what I'll be covering today, I just wanted to mention the name of the talk, Walk With Me Among My Homelands, Hear the Echoes of My Ancestors. So what I'll do today is to blend what I learned from my parents and my grandparents. A lot of what I learned is from my grandmother and my mother, and then a lot of my clan relatives in the community. And I was a librarian on the University of Wisconsin campus for 36 years. But more than that, about 30 or 40 years, I've actually been looking at Ho-Chunk history when I did research as an undergraduate, starting out at La Crosse, then UW-Milwaukee, then Madison. So it's been an interesting experience, and I learned a lot with what I was doing over the years. So what I plan to do is blend some of the teachings of my family and our values with the research that I've done. So I'm going to cover a few things along the way that may be familiar to you, and then others are going to be something new. And when I talk about the echoes of my ancestors, I'll try as much as I can to weave in some Ho-Chunk words, because I know their words were shared in this territory, and if you walk in the valleys in the riverside and into the trees and into the cliffs, you probably would hear the echo of their Ho-Chunk language. So I'll move on to my first slide and just talk with you about centering and being centered as we begin talking. Because the way that I learned was from my grandmother and my mother. A lot of what we were told was to be quiet, to sit there, to listen, and to learn. And so we really didn't speak out. We listened to what our elders told us, and we also obeyed whatever they told us to do. So the fire to me represents that campfire of the home setting, and just being around outdoors and sitting around the campfire. Even you and some of your families, when you're outdoors and summertime and in the evening and you have a fireplace, it's a chance for you to reconnect with your own family, your generations, and all the relatives and friends who talk together and share family stories and values. So in the same way, that's what our Ho-Chunk people did. And the fire represents, to me, the place where our women relatives cooked and centered the family and gathered around the fireplace. So to me, it represents the role that we as women have in our families to bring our food to the fireplace, cook it, and serve the family. So that's also what it represents to me. And maybe some of the holidays that you have indoors, you have your fireplace going, and it's hot cider and all of the treats. So it's a chance for all of us, as we center ourselves around the fireplace, to really be aware of who we are, our family, our kinship system, and all of those nice feelings that we get by knowing who we are and where we're from. So I'll talk a little bit about Ho-Chunk people and where we're from and what we've learned, our journey, and where we are today, and try to mix in some Ho-Chunk values with that. Ho-Chunk people are considered people of the woodlands. And so when we are referred to by our other Ho-Chunk people around the country, we're called Wazitachi, which means we live among the woodlands, among the pines. And also water is very important to us. In fact, the story of where our Ho-Chunk people came from, we say that we came among this world by Mogashuch, which is the Red Banks, and that's near present-day Green Bay by Door County. So some of you might have been there. So that's where we're told we are from. You also may have read in the history books about the Winnebago people, and that's a name that was given to us by the Algonquian speaking people, Winnipegek, which meant people of the stinky waters, and people of the pungent waters that were near Green Bay and Lake Winnebago. So that's how we got that name from them. And then the history books wrote it down in earlier in the 20th century, saying Winnebago. And actually we are, if you've read any of our books or seen publications around the state, you might have seen that we're called people of the big voice. We're also remembered for that amongst our people because of our linguistic group. Ho-Chungra means people of the big voice, and an example of how that came about is some of the elders said that when they were in winter camps, instead of staying in one small wigwam, or chipotoke in Ho-Chunk language, they gathered in large, long wigwams, a longer house with lots of fireplaces in there. And so when the men had to speak to someone on the other end, they had to dig deep down, and their voice would carry all the way through the lodge to reach the other end of the lodge. So that's where we get the name Ho-Chungra. The other thing I'd like to say, because I'm talking about Ho-Chunk language, is to mention to you the linguistic group that we're from. The linguistic group is called, it's actually called Siouan, and it's not the Sioux language, it's the Siouan linguistic group. And there are several branches on the branch of linguistics. And Chiweri is one group, and they are the Oto, Misuria, and I can't remember the other group right now, the other tribe. And then there's the other wing that's called Degiha, and in that one, that's much larger. We have the Omaha, Omaha, Ponca, Quapaw, Kansa, and Mandan Hidatsa, and also includes Osage people. So those are, we consider relatives because we speak the same root language, and we often say we're the parent language because many people still come back to us because we still have elders who still speak the language, and so they call us their grandfathers. The Ho-Chunk people are the grandfathers of these other tribes with linguistic speaking abilities. So it's really been interesting as I travel across the country to run into people who are from the other tribes. And at one point when I was really young, I was at a powwow in Kansas, and I was sitting on a bench, and I could hear an elder woman speaking to the man who was in charge of the microphone, the master of ceremonies, and she was talking to him on the side before he pulled the microphone up, and I could hear her speaking, and she was saying to him, she was really proud of her son, and he had accomplished many things, so she wanted to give everybody gifts for what he had done, and so she was very grateful. And then I was sitting there and realized, I'm in Kansas and I know what she's saying. And then I realized that, later found out that she was from the Oto Nation. So there's things like that that happen to us when we're traveling, and so many of the tribes have other related tribes that have a similar language. I have a picture here, our drawing of Chugiga, or Spoon Decorah. He was the son of Glory of the Morning, and the way you pronounce her name in Ho-Chunk is, let's see how, I'm trying to think of how we say her name. Hamboguinga was her name. And she married a French soldier, and when she was young, and as an elder, she headed the village by Lake Winnebago on Doty Island. And when Jonathan Carver was traveling through in 1766, he came to her village and asked for permission to travel the waters, to come along the Fox River and then to the Wisconsin. And so he stayed there several days and spoke well of her. And well, anyway, she was a leader, and her sons and her children became leaders. Her husband, Sabwa Dikari, ended up moving back to Canada, and they had had several children. He took the daughter with him when he went back up to Quebec, but he got killed in action up there, and so they never came back. But the sons remained here in Wisconsin, and two of them, Chugiga and Gray-Headed Decorah, were brothers. And Chugiga is in a lot of writings and was involved in several battles in the war that was with Pontiac and Tecumseh and the Shawnee Prophet. And he also had, or his brother, Gray-Headed Decorah, had two children, two sons. Well, he had many children, but these are the two that are most prominent that you might remember from reading history books. Wakan Decorah is on the left, and some of the cities in Iowa are named after him. Wakan, Iowa, and Decorah, Iowa, in honor of Wakan Decorah. And he lived along just about 60 to 80 miles north of Prairie du Chien on the Mississippi River. And then One-Eyed Decorah was the head of the villages over by Prairie La Crosse. So that was his prominent area. But I'd like to say that they didn't just stay in one little village and remain there. There was a lot of traveling that was done because of the hunting and the game. So it was really an interesting time for them and a lot of traveling. And so I like to compare it, instead of the way we're described in the history books, the nomadic people. I wouldn't call it that. It was economically sound thing to do, to travel like that, to feed your family, and then to gain what was in the market with the traders, the fur traders that were in the region, like Milwaukee and all the way down to Chicago and Green Bay, down to Prairie du Chien and on down to St. Louis. So it was really a lot of trade going on. And so there was a lot of traveling. Our Ho-Chunk people covered all the way from Green Bay area all the way down to Dixon, Illinois. And it was easy for them to travel down to Rock Island, Illinois to be among the Sac and Fox people. So that was an exciting time. So I like to compare it to some of our people today that come down from Canada, from Quebec, and they come down in snowbirds, and they come on down to here, or they go further down to Florida. And there are some people around that I've met in Madison that may have a cabin up in Vilas County or something, and then they'll live in Madison, and then they'll have a condo down in the Ozark Mountains or the Smoky Mountains, and then they'll have their other condo down in Florida, and they all call that home. So that's the same for us. Those are our places that we call home, and so our Ho-Chunk people are able to travel in that way. So I have those feelings about my relatives who did a lot of traveling across the Midwest. This is just a reminder of how we became Wisconsin. So if you'll notice, the states in the middle there are the old Northwest Territory. So when I mentioned Tecumseh and Shawnee Prophet, they were in the Ohio River Valley and up into Michigan, and then into Indiana, and the Shawnee people were there. So some of my ancestors were involved with Tecumseh and also working their way down the Rock River and then on down to that area of the country. So that was the location. And so you can see that eventually Wisconsin became a state. But even prior to that, when it was the old Northwest Territory, Wisconsin's borderline included Chicago, but somehow when the negotiations happened and Illinois became a state, they moved on up, and so the borderline is down by Beloit. But that's still Ho-Chunk territory, and even some of the northern Illinois counties, there's Winnebago County down there, and the Rock River and the Sugar River and the Pecatonica all go down in there and join up with the Rock River. So I call that home. So I really enjoy knowing about the history of where my relatives used to live. And then you see that Wisconsin became a state in 1848. You'll see there where it says Indiana, 1816. That's when the Treaty of Peace was signed with all the tribes in Wisconsin. The indigenous tribes of Wisconsin signed at that time. So, but even though it's called the Peace Treaty, it wasn't really a treaty of peace. It was all with the intention of taking over on the Indian lands. And that's why Black Hawk reacted the way that he did with a treaty that wasn't valid. And the Ho-Chunk people feel that same way about one of our other treaties. This is old Fort Winnebago, which is at Portage. So during that time period when the Ho-Chunks were going to be removed, they had signed some treaties. John Kinsey was placed as the Indian agent at Fort Winnebago at Portage. And at that time, our fort, our area of location was really actually the center was Prairie du Chien for the Ho-Chunk people. But then they built that fort, so we had two places to go. And that was coming down from Green Bay. So you have to remember that for this area of the country, the headquarters had been from Michigan, moving upper Michigan, down this way by Green Bay. And so that was the source of power. All the Great Lakes and the waterways, that was the power source. And the Mississippi was a part of it. So when we think of Madison as the center or headquarters of everything, it really wasn't. It was just a second thought to some people. And so that's why the Indian Agency was built at Portage for just that reason, because of the waterways, the importance of travel on the water. So I talked about the removal and the movement of the people. So the orange area on the map shows you the Ho-Chunk territory that was eventually negotiated by the treaties. So the treaty, one of the treaties was in Prairie du Chien, and all of the previous treaties, the first one, the one of 1816, the Treaty of Peace, was down in St. Louis. So whenever they negotiated treaties with the people, they did it on the indigenous land of the people, and that's where the negotiations were going on. And so at one point, this is how they worked it out, that the orange area would be Ho-Chunk territory and all the other tribes are in the other section. But the removals happened, and so the dark area next to the orange, the brown, is the neutral ground, which covers Decorah, Iowa, and Waukon, Iowa. They're in that region. That was called the Neutral Territory because it was a buffer zone between the Sac and Fox that were down below in Iowa, and up above were the Dakota and Lakota people. So they were fighting each other, and they put the Ho-Chunk in between as a buffer, and so that didn't work too well. So the Ho-Chunks moved way up to the top there, Long Prairie, and they didn't stay there all that long either because they missed the fertile lands of Wisconsin, and so they came back down, and they were down in Blue Earth, Minnesota, and that's down near Mankato. And they were there for a while, and there was a second treaty while they were in Blue Earth, Minnesota for the reservation there, and split it up. And in that time when they were at Blue Earth, many of the, I shouldn't say many, but a portion of the Ho-Chunk people started becoming farmers and living in nice houses and just being a part of the community, but still being fluent in their language and being bilingual. And so that was what happened there. But somehow when the Sioux Uprising happened, the Ho-Chunk got mixed in there. So it was like guilty by association, or maybe like we tell our children, be careful who you hang out with because you might get labeled the same way they did. Or if your face is brown and they're brown, then you get lumped together and there you go. So anyway, our Ho-Chunk people got removed all the way over to Crow Creek in the Dakota Territory. And that was, if any of you have been out near Crow Creek, near Pierre, South Dakota, it's very desolate compared to the beautiful greenery of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and not very many beautiful lakes and streams like we have here in our state. So they didn't last there very long. A lot of people died along the way. And those who didn't die came back and got, by going on the Missouri River. They used dugout canoes and they traveled down the Missouri River, and they met the Omaha people down near Iowa and Nebraska, southern Iowa and northern Nebraska. And some of them were even on their way to Kansas because at that time with the negotiations with the US government, they were trying to put the American Indian people into Kansas. So there was a spot there for them, and so some of them were going down there. But a lot of our people kept coming home. So even with this removal map, it isn't like they took everyone and they left. A lot of people came home as soon as they could, just like you would. If your children go to college, they leave on that one weekend, and next thing you know, they're home, and or they're lonesome and they want to be back. It's kind of like that same thing. They came back right away, and some never left. I'm just going to give you some names of the Ho-Chunk leaders because some of you may never hear their names. And so I just want to mention them so you can, so in this room and outdoors, we can hear the echo of their names. White Crow, Little Thunder, Broken Shoulder, Keto Money, Iron Walker, Whirling Thunder, and Little Priest. Whirling Thunder and Little Priest were farther down by the Rock River by Lake Koshkonong. That was their main villages. And then Iron Walker, some of you, if you go toward Madison, may have been through Mazomanie. That is actually, Iron Walker is Masomani. And so they couldn't say Masomani, so they just called the town Mazomanie. So that's in honor of him. Keto Money was very active, a strong leader. He had villages by Baraboo and all the way down toward Dane County, down toward Beloit. And so there's a village down there called Turtle Village, and so that's right near Beloit, South Beloit. So right in there, the Rock River comes down, and then our K-Chunk village is there. Here's a few other names, and I included a little bit of the Ho-Chunk in there so you can hear their names. Manape, soldier, he was one of the ones who signed the treaty. And then Modaje was Little Priest. And Modaje actually means traveling. It means to visit and to keep traveling. But he was also called Little Priest. So some of our leaders sometimes had two names. And my father had two names, but there aren't really a lot of people who had two names, but Modaje had two names. White Breast, Monk Skugga, is from the same clan I'm from. I'm in Ho-Chunk, from the Bear clan. So the white breast refers to a bear that has the white markings on the chest. And then Whirling Thunder was a strong leader. He was all the way from Lake Koshkonong, covering all this territory, and now we have a ranch over by Toma that's called Whirling Thunder. It's named after him. This is an example of some of the men who signed the treaties, and then I have a list, not a list, but actually if we look at the back row, the two men on the far right, they are interpreters or translators. Their fathers were French Canadian and their mothers were Ho-Chunk. The one on the far right is Michael St. Cyr. He was also a trader, fur trader, interpreter, translator, and then next to him is Alex Pear. So he was also a translator. So one of the things that is important in all of Indian history, different tribes, is that the negotiations and leadership and economy depended on the people that were bilingual and multilingual. So, and sometimes they were quadrilingual because they knew several languages, or maybe the mother was from a different tribe, so they knew that language as well. And so they needed to do the fur trading, so they always had these leaders together helping the government or the trading post leaders. On the far left, we have Young Prophet, and then Whirling Thunder again, he's still got the bear claws on his chest. And then White Breast again. This time he's dressed a little more in street clothes than he was in the previous photo. And then Little Decorah and Little Hill. So Little Decorah and Little Hill are really famous in Minnesota history. So if you look in Minnesota historical collections, you'll see both of them mentioned there. And eventually they migrated to Winnebago, Nebraska. But we still have Little Decorah's land property that's in Jackson County, which is north of Toma and going up toward Black River Falls. So Little Decorah had property there, plus Mankato by Blue Earth, Minnesota. So there's really a lot of history with each of these leaders, but I just wanted to point them out so that you knew who was speaking, who was multilingual, and the echoes of their words. And then you see Whirling Thunder is carrying a feather, a fan, and then White Breast has a peace pipe, and then Little Decorah has the rifle. So it's all representative of what was going on during that time. I mentioned that the removal and just showed you the map of where everyone went, but there's also removal and return, and there's also people that never left at all. So if you see the woman, look at the woman on the right, the grandmother carrying her little grandson on her back. That's how my grandmother carried me. So when I was growing up as a child, I would walk with my grandmother and she would teach me about life. It wasn't just stories. She taught me about life and how to behave, what to do, just everyday living. And I was only about that tall, only about 4 years old, and I would listen to what she's saying. So one time my sister and I were walking in Decorah County with our grandmother and walking on the dirt road. We were on our way to see our relatives that were picking cherries in Cherryland. And so my grandmother put my sister on her back, just like this photo. And then she took me by the hand and pulled me along, and then she told us stories as we walked along. And then my feet got tired, so then she took my sister off her back, put her down, and then I got on her back because my feet were exhausted. But that's how it was. That's how we learned, because we spent time with our grandparents. So it was a time to listen, learn, and be a part of the community and learn about life. And then we often had questions for her because we were so low to the ground. We had so many questions about what we were seeing. So it was an enjoyable life, and so I really enjoyed my time with my grandmother, Winik Shujinka. Her name was Redbird. This is a map of the 4 lakes And we call it Dejope, and other people call it Madison. So I put the 4 lakes there because there were a lot of villages and Indian mounds and our early villages. So that's just a map of the area, but I wanted to just point this out because when I mentioned our fort at Portage, John Kinsey was responsible when that fort was first opened up, because the plan already was, after the peace treaty, remove the Winnebago people out of here. So he was there to take a census. So between these years, he took a census of all the territory. And at that time, Ho-Chunk people did not have a first and last name. So when the census came, then eventually some people did get a Christian name, first and last name. So I wanted to point out that some of our leaders of our villages were women, because I showed you all the men, but we don't have photos of these women because they always stayed behind. They were always in the village taking care of what I said, the fireplace and the cooking and the meals and taking care of the village. So Wakajowiga lived on Lake Monona, and she was from the Thunderbird clan. And Wakanjowiga means thunder woman. And then Hinakega was at Lake Monona. And when the census taker asked her what her name was, she just gave her birth order name, which is Hinake is the 4th born daughter. And so when they asked her what her name was, she said Hinake. So she never gave them her spirit name. So she only gave them her birth order name, which is Hinakega. So when the census taker wrote down what clan they were from, there was no way to tell because it was just her birth order name. So we don't know what clan she was from. And Chonakewinga was on Lake Wabisa, and she was from the Bear clan. And the next one, Wakopiniwinga, was on Lake Wabisa, and she was Water Spirit clan. And Hachachehiwinga was from Lake Kiganza, and she was Bear clan. And that's where I live. I live on Lake Kiganza, so I'm not very far from the village. So when I walk about a mile down, I'm into the state park, and I'm by Mammoth Village where all the leaders were. And just south of there, if anybody here has ever gone to La Follette Park, just south of Lake Kiganza State Park, that's where the trader had his trading post. And a lot of the Ho-Chunks were right there in the state park, which is where the village was. And then the maple grove is right there, and they used to tap the maple trees and have a lot of maple syrup like today that I have at the table. So it was really a nice place. And so I enjoy it each day when I walk into the state park and in that region. And that, I'm trying to think of the leader's name, Rasdell was the fur trader at that campsite by La Follette Park. And he married a Ho-Chunk woman. And then she passed away, and he married another Ho-Chunk woman. But then when the removal happened, she wanted to go with her family. They all left, and so she went with her, all her relatives, and her husband remained still in the territory doing his business. And then he ended up marrying a non-Ho-Chunk after that and remained in Dane County. I think he moved eventually up by DeForest and that little town south of DeForest. I can't think of the town right now, but right in that region is where he moved, Token Creek. And then back to the removal, just as a reminder of the process that we've been going through. So the echoes of my relatives have been felt all the way from Rock River, the tip of the little Italy tippy toe there, all the way up and across all the removals, and then coming back. And some of the people came back, or never left, I should say. And the image that I showed you with the woman and the baby on her back, the soldier is being asked by the woman to just kill her, take the bayonet and just kill me because I don't want to leave my grandfather and my father's grave. I want to be where my relatives are. I don't want to leave. And so she was crying and crying on his grave, and the soldier said to one of the other men, "What would it hurt? Let's let her stay. And then let's let one of the young boys stay with her. And because she doesn't have long to live anyway, so let's just leave her here." And so he stayed with her, and the rest of the tribe continued on. So some people like her either hid in the woods and didn't get found, and so they were still in the area. And that was just one example of what happened and why people wanted to keep coming back. You may wonder how we're still Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin and have federal recognition and are able to do the things that we do. It's because of people like Chief Yellow Thunder, Wakanjaziga. He was a leader in Columbia County. I mean, you could just say he was all over the territory, and he negotiated the treaties. And one of the treaties, the Treaty of 1837, is contested because people who did not have the right to sign a treaty were sent out to Washington. And as I told you earlier, the treaties were signed on our turf, Prairie du Chien, all in our territory. But they took these men and took them to Washington and forced them to sign a treaty. And they were told they had 8 months to move. And they thought, well, 8 months, we probably can renegotiate and we don't have to leave in 8 months. But they actually meant 8 years, but then they took 8 months to try to get them out. And that's what happened there. So that there's that controversy. And during that time, Wakanjazi signed the treaty, but he always wanted to be home like the other relatives. So he purchased some land in the town of Delton, right by Wisconsin Dells. And he was able to provide a stopping off place for the relatives who were coming back from Nebraska, Minnesota, and Iowa, and the Dakotas. Whenever they came back, they had his place to come to, and his relatives could stay there. We also had Ahuchoinga, and some of you might have heard of Ahuchoga. He was on the Baraboo River. So his village is right near the west side of Reedsburg. So that's where he was, and the Baraboo River. His family followed the Baraboo River all the way down to Baraboo. And so he did the same thing too. He purchased land, and so when the cavalry came and tried to load them, the relatives up and take them to Minnesota, they weren't able to because he had the deed to the land. And some of the neighbors, the non-native neighbors, came and helped him wave the deed in front of them and show them that he really owned the land here, so don't remove him. So that's how he provided a place for everyone to come home to. And my great-grandfather did the same too as well. So let me just grab a photo of him that I brought. This is my great-grandfather, Hipahiga, and he purchased land by La Crescent. So if you've ever been near Hoka, Minnesota, that was his land there, Hoka and Brownsville. So, and these are the one on his left, which would be your right, that's my great-grandmother. And then I have another photo. This is her again on the right. Her name was Najupiinga, and she was Deer Clan. And then that's my grandfather in the middle. His name was Lee Sam, and his Ho-Chunk name is Ruhaminka, and he was Snake Clan. So those are the kinds of, and he had a huge place where people, when they were coming back, would always have the stopping off point and a lot of ceremonies at La Crescent and Hoka and Brownsville. And from there we moved into the boarding school experience. And so a lot of my relatives, especially from Nebraska, were sent to Carlisle Indian School. So the children who had long hair had everything cut short. So you can see in the photo on the right that the children have short hair and the girls are wearing uniforms, and so are the young men way in the back. So they're segregated. The young women are in front and the young men are in the back. So that's how it was at Carlisle. And one of my relatives, ancestors, Angel Decorah, was a teacher. Eventually she taught art at Carlisle Indian School. And to the left is Neilsville Indian School. My father went there and my mother went there. And they didn't stay that long. They just went there for a while. And my older sister attended school at Neilsville. And she had trouble there because they were punished for speaking our Ho-Chunk language. And so a lot of the schools punished the children for speaking the language. And they could speak the language out on the playground when no one could hear them if they wanted to, but they tried to speak English as much as possible. Plus other tribes were in there too. The Ojibwe were in there and some Ottawa and Menominee children. So they didn't know each other's language then when they were little children, so they had to speak English, so that made it easier for them. And then what happened to my sister, older sister at Neilsville School, is that when she was in first grade, she couldn't speak English. She went to school only being a fluent Ho-Chunk speaker. And when she got there, the teacher, her teacher kept punishing her. Every time she uttered a Ho-Chunk word or asked a question in Ho-Chunk, the teacher took a pencil and poked her in the head with it. So by the time my mother came for Thanksgiving to bring her home, she told her what had happened, so my mother didn't bring her back to Neilsville. And she kept her home, and she asked my father and all my relatives and grandparents, if possible, let's speak English to her so that she can learn the English language. And then by then, this was about 1940, would have to have been 1948. The public schools, the rural public schools were open to Indian children to come to the schools. So by then, she was able to speak English pretty well and went to our rural school in our neighborhood. And the teacher there was fantastic. She would let them speak Ho-Chunk. There were other Ho-Chunk children in the same school, and they would use Ho-Chunk words here and there, and the teacher would say, oh, what did you say? Or how do you say this? So she would always want to learn the language, and she treated them really well. So that's where I eventually went to school. It's the same school, and I had a different teacher, but everyone in the school was so nice. That was a really great experience for me. So even though my older sister went through her struggles, she never let that be known to me at all. And she taught me so many things, and she loved school, even though her early start wasn't that great. So I'm really glad that my grandmother and my mother and my older sister loved school, because then I loved school too. The other thing that happened during that time period is our young men went to war. Even during the Civil War, our Ho-Chunk people were fighting in the Civil War as well. So they were in all of the wars when you think about it. The French and Indian War, the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam. So they were serving in all those capacities. And Corporal Mitchell Red Cloud, you may have heard of him. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor for valor in the Korean War, and his mother received his Congressional Medal of Honor for him because he was killed in action. And then the seal that's up in the upper right-hand corner is the seal for the Ho-Chunk code talkers. So a lot of our men were speaking Ho-Chunk, even though we say it was, the teachers didn't allow it in the schools, they still retained it. So when they went to battle in World War II, the officers were aware that the Ho-Chunk could speak our own language and they could speak fluently. So that's how they became code talkers and used a code that the enemy could not break. So that's how the Ho-Chunk people helped in World War II. So songs have been dedicated to them, and I think people are really not aware of how patriotic the Ho-Chunk people are in Indian nations, because wherever you go and we have a public event, there's always a flag there and flag raisings and our ceremonies, and each of our veterans get, the widow gets the flag, and so the family really remembers their veterans, and so we honor them in so many ways. And the soldiers became familiar with the English language and the way of life. They went to France, so how were they going to want to come back to the Kickapoo Valley or Toma again? So they ended up being fluent in the language and got familiar with the different ways of the big cities. And so that fell in line with the Eisenhower administration when they wanted them to be relocated to Chicago and the urban areas. So a lot of our Ho-Chunk people went to Chicago. They went to St. Paul and Minneapolis, Dallas, San Francisco, LA. So there really were a lot of people traveling to those places, and you can see that they retained the culture there. So it was pan-Indian, and so we still had our Ho-Chunk language, yet we also had tribal events, the powwows, and there's a young man singing a song with his hand drum and the city skyline in the background. And this is a photo of my relatives in Nebraska on the far left. And the little guy that's next to the man with the headdress in the last row, the little guy is my grandfather, Weejarep, David Lincoln Sr. So, and next to him is Art Walker, one of the other Bear Clan relatives. And to the right, we have some of our grass dancers, because we have become more pan-Indian and borrow from one another and share together. And maybe even a relative is from one of those tribes that has that same style. And the women are in the back, just like this, like being around the fire. The women are honoring the veterans, staying to the back and singing for them and supporting them. When they return from battle, the women were always there. And then the young men returning from battle. And so the fireplace, like I said, is really important to us, a place of centering and a place of sharing and hearing the echoes of what our elders have told us and letting it roll on down to the next generations. So one of the values that my grandmother always told me is to pray every day. So face the east, and when the sun rises, face the east and be grateful for what you have. The other one of the teachings is when you have a guest and they come to your house, be sure and offer them some water to drink, and then some food, because you want to feed their spirit. You want them to be rejuvenated and happy. So you share a good conversation with them. So when they leave, they have good memories of their time with you, and you've strengthened them on their journey, as well as strengthening yourself. So that's what some of the teachings we've had. And water is really important to us. The waterways, the drinking water, the springs. We consider them sacred sites. So our future belongs to our young people. So we try to tell them our stories and try to get them around the fireplace and continue to share with them, and so that they can be part of the echo of our ancestors. Thank you to all of you. I'm grateful to all of you.
Couple of thoughts.
Thoughts, okay.
Here, you can address them as you enter.
Pardon me?
Place names, Oshkosh, Toma. Relationships there, I presume. Creation story. Efforts by the nation to revive the language with the younger generation. And something else in my head. Down on the Rock River at Oregon, Illinois, there is a 50-foot plus tall statue of, have you seen this?
I've seen it on Smithsonian Channel.
Well, it's named after Black Hawk, who was not Ho-Chunk, I don't believe.
No.
Okay, so I would just, it's essentially in Ho-Chunk traditional territory. So
What was the name of the town?
Oregon.
Oh, okay.
It's south of Rockford.
South of Rockford. Oh.
It's actually in a state park. just outside of town, Loudon State Park. The statue, well, there used to be an art an art colony there that, Laredo Taft was the guy's name. And he was a sculptor. And he got this idea to build this huge statue. It's quite a sight.
I'd love to see it. In fact, I can add a little to the story because I didn't cover that much about Black Hawk, but there was intermarriage between the Sac and the Ho-Chunk, and so one of the leaders was called the Wabakishik, and his mother was Ho-Chunk and his father was Sac. And so his name was Wabakishik, but in the Ho-Chunk language his name was Mahiska, white cloud. And so in many of these communities, no matter where they are, there's intermarriage across tribal lines in areas. So there's Potawatomis intermarried with Ho-Chunk, or Menominee intermarried, just like the fur traders are intermarried with the Ho-Chunk women. So there, that could be why they did that, because the cornfields, we share the same value on our cornfields. And so if you look at the tribes that are in this region, in this corn belt, it's more important to us in our ceremonies to have corn. You go all the way to Nebraska. Corn is we use in our ceremony. It's special corn, flint corn, that we use. We don't use Libby's from Minnesota. We use our own corn. And it's the same with the Oneida people from New York. Everybody along those river valleys coming westward, that's all our ceremonies include corn. You go farther north by Lake Superior, the Menominee and the Anishinaabe people, or we call them Regachi, the Ojibwe people, have wild rice. And so that's what they have to have at their ceremonies, is the wild rice and the walleye. And then with us, it's more the venison, the buffalo, and the corn. So, so that was the same value to the Sac and the Fox people, that corn. And so sometimes it's the food that ties the people together. What nourishes you ties you together. The songs that you sing, the words that you say, and the ceremonies that you have, the dances that you have that are shared among people. So that ties them together. So I feel that it's fine that he has the image there, and there probably was a reason for that, but I feel like we're all related in some way when we value the same thing. We all value the beauty here that we have, and I was just admiring the people that were out on the deck taking photos out there as I was walking in. So I'm really glad that I could be here and that we have many of the same values in our own communities. Any other questions?
In the photo of the children in front of the school, I noticed there were many more young boys than there were girls. Were more boys removed from the reservations than the girls?
It seems like they were. When I looked at some of the records from Nebraska, because that's where they recorded a lot of this. Angel Decorah, who became an art teacher eventually, she was part of recruiting people to go to Carlisle. And she was related to Oliver Lemire, and some of the leaders of that time that went to the private schools got together, and they started bringing people to what do you call them? Boarding schools and mission schools. So, so I see it probably was a strategy that the young men, the leaders, would forget what some of their teachings were about going to war, going to battle, going to hunt, going to fish, forget those things, become more acculturated. And so I can see your point about possibly that being one of the approaches to use so that the men were separated from home. Yes?
Going back to one of the first gentleman's thoughts, the creation story, can you share how your people feel the world was created?
Those are stories that we only tell in wintertime. So when the snow is on the ground, that's what most tribes say. When the snow is on the ground, you can start telling those stories. And the other tribes, they might put them in their museum, and you walk in, you see their creation story. Well, Ho-Chunks don't, so I won't say anything about that. But we each have our stories too. We have clan stories, our own clan creation stories, like even the Hopi people, when they say they came up from the ground, they each have their own story. So that's one group of Hopi people who have a story, but not every clan of a tribe has the same creation story. So that was one of the things that when we started our Ho-Chunk Museum, they were saying, oh no, what story should I tell, because there's so many creation stories. So that would be something that would be heard during winter when snow is on the ground. And also the Snake Clan says that you tell the stories as soon as the snakes stop wandering around on the lands. So if it got cold enough the next few weeks and there still is no snow, but the snakes have gone to hibernate, you can tell then. So it all depends on what clan you are. And my mother was Snake Clan, that's why I know some of these things. I can only tell you what I've been told by my parents and grandparents. And I didn't tell you, Greg, my grandmother, I showed the one that's Deer Clan, but my paternal grandmother was Thunder Clan. And then of course, on my father's side, everybody's Bear Clan on the patrilineal side. And then on my mother's side, her father was Snake Clan. And then, let me think if there's another clan in there. Nope, I've covered all the clans. We're also related to Little Decorah in Jackson County. So we still have land up in Jackson County that's Indian land or Ho-Chunk land. And Highway 12 went right through our land. And the railroad went right through our land. And so when I was a college student, I found out that Department of Transportation never paid our family for going through our property. So my husband, who was a law student, helped me negotiate that, and our family was able to get compensated for the land that they took to make little old Highway 12 going through Jackson County. But that's part of Little Decorah's land in there that my grandfather inherited on his mother's side. Her name was Hinukmachi. She was Thunder Clan as well.
So you were talking about your grandfather was Snake Clan, so then that was on your mother's side?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're Bear from your father's side,
Mm-hmm.
that's how it's passed down.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it follows patrilineal lines, but one of the anthropologists that has studied the Ho-Chunk people has said she thinks way, way back we were matrilineal, because many of the customs and things that we do fall in line with other matrilineal tribes. So the things that we value, the things that we teach, follow. And the teasing and joking relationships in the kinship patterns that we follow are all similar to the same pattern as the matrilineal. So she said, I wonder when they turned patrilineal, and it could have been with the treaty signing, because even when Black Hawk was coming through, Catherine Mayotte, her father was French Canadian and she was Ho-Chunk. She was sent down to help with negotiations so that they wouldn't flare up the way that it did, but the men wouldn't listen to her. But she was trusted and respected by the leadership of the Ho-Chunk people. But she went down there and they wouldn't listen to her, wouldn't even speak to her, wouldn't even let her have a voice. So anyway, it makes me think maybe we were matrilineal, just like she said, but who knows? Right now we're following patrilineal. Yes?
I wanted to ask about how did your ancestors think of this idea of purchasing their own land, which is like the very European thing to do, and basically protect themselves in so many ways, whereas other tribes weren't able to do that?
Let's see. I can only guess what they were feeling and thinking. That's the only way that they can protect themselves. Otherwise, the soldiers come with the rifles again and make them leave. But if they have a piece of paper that shows that they can be there, then they can do that. The other thing is literacy. As a librarian, I'm going to say literacy, because those who could read were able to gain what they did. Those who were not able to read and just depended on the language and what they heard and what they saw, they're good people, but didn't understand what the paper meant, that a right that you could have. So I think that's partially what they went through, and so I think literacy was really important, and multilingualism, because I would say they could be multilingual, but they didn't always know the written language. So even though the interpreters were multilingual or bilingual, they weren't reading in the language. In fact, even some of the letters that were first sent to some of the presidents from the Ho-Chunk people, they are written in French. And so when the president receives the letter, he has to find somebody who can translate the French letter, the letter in French language, so that he understands what the Ho-Chunk are asking. So, so that's kind of how it was in the earlier stages. But eventually, people learned English, and they had a school on the other side of the river. When Turkey River, when they crossed Mississippi and went into Iowa, then there was a school there. And they were negotiating on who would run the school. And it got started, and just like anybody, you know, when you have the crops and it's hunting season, you know, you leave. Your parents need you to help them with bringing things in. So those children would not come to school on certain days because it was their time to fish or their time to hunt. So, and then the young women maybe needed to take care of the grandmother. So taking care of the grandmother is more important than sitting at a table and trying to figure out what's on this paper. So that's kind of what happened at that school. But the school in Blue Earth, Minnesota by Mankato, they were already learning, and which is why they purchased the, I don't know if they necessarily purchased the land, but they asked in the treaty for some status so that they would be able to stay and continue to keep farming and give up their rights and vote in the elections in Minnesota. So they did. They started voting. And my great-grandfather, Hipahiga, in Minnesota, in La Crescent, he voted. And so he would vote in the elections, but it wasn't until 1924 that the Indian people had the right to vote, but we really never practiced it unless they had land, like some of them did, like you've asked. And then it wasn't until the 1960s, when it went from Eisenhower to Kennedy, that people started to be able to vote, to exercise their rights to vote. Because if they didn't speak English and they didn't understand all the things going on around them, they wouldn't know to vote. But if someone was literate enough and knew some of the things coming up, then they would instruct them to, oh, get out there and vote, go register, be sure and get out and vote.
You mentioned taking care of the grandmother. When you showed the photo of your grandmother, well, not your grandmother, the elderly woman traveling. When you were walking with your grandmother and your sister, your grandmother picked you up when you got tired. Who decided when grandmother could stop walking?
She did. She was always the boss. In our whole family, I think it's matrilineal when I think about it, because we have property in Monroe County, and it's not Indian land, it's taxable land. But my would be my, how should I explain this? My grandmother and her sister wanted my father to purchase land, to not go to job and keep traveling around. Buy some land, stay there, raise your family. And so by the time I was born, and then my younger sister and my third sister, Hinakia, like was in the writings, when she was born, then they were moving toward buying the land. And so that was because my grandmother wanted that to happen. And my grandmother was also a member of the church at the mission in Black River Falls. And you had to learn English and read the Bible and all of that. So she learned all of that and impressed upon my father to do what he did. And so I think it was really the instruction of my grandmother, because my grandfather couldn't read or write. But I don't know how he did it. He drove a car and he was able to buy groceries sometimes. I just wonder how he did it, because he couldn't read and he couldn't write, and he hardly spoke English. I think I've only heard him on this many times saying something in English. And he learned some things from the TV. A few words here and there. Milwaukee Braves, that's what he... I hope I answered your question.
So we hear so many things now about the negative side of the Indian schools, but you have a real positive side about the relationships and the advantages that you gained in the Indian schools, or that your people did.
Yeah, my mother learned so many nice, I should probably say a lot of good habits. They focused mainly on housekeeping, sewing, cooking, you know, all of the etiquette, proper, you know, all of that. So when I grew up, we had to sit at the table and we had to eat together, and you didn't leave the table until you were excused. And, you know, it gave a chance for each of us children to talk with one another, and my father, when he came home from work, to learn how school was and how things were going with us, and my mom as well. So it was a chance to have a dialogue. So I really feel like some of the things that she learned, she carried with her from the school, what she learned there. So the negative side of it is that it doesn't make you trusting of the schools and the school district because of how you were treated by administration at these schools. So we don't trust administration, but we might trust a teacher, or we would trust a classmate. But when it comes to administration and time to show up for the PTA meeting or PTO, you don't go because it's not going to be that good. You know, it's not inviting, not welcoming, and a reminder of what was done to yourself or what was done to your parents. So that's why you don't see as many Ho-Chunk people as active in the schools as others, but not me. I was in debate, I was in GAA, I was in the PEP club, you know, so many things I joined when I was in school. Future Teachers of America, I was in that. So many things that I did that were enjoyable, and I made lots of friends. So I was treated equally, so I felt bad when I got to the big urban settings where it wasn't that way. Everybody was friendly. Even when I left Toma and I started freshman year at La Crosse, it was so fun to see everybody. And people from back home in Toma, hi, hi. And it was so fun to see all my classmates that had gone to school at La Crosse as well. So it was enjoyable. So I'm sorry that it's been hard for some people, but it wasn't that difficult for me. I mean, I've seen it, I've heard it, and I've been there myself when you're told by a teacher that you'll never make it. You might as well give up now, you're not going to make it. And so I never responded, but in my mind, I left the room. I was like, I'll show you. And I never went back and emailed him or sent a letter saying, here's my diploma, here's my, you know, you think those kinds of things, but sometimes it's a motivation. That negative jab makes you move and do something to the good. So that's part of my story. So thank you for your question. I don't know how much time we have. Is this?
I mean, we can take as much time as people want. Are there further questions?
Let's get back to Oshkosh and Toma.
Oh yeah, Oshkosh and Toma are not Ho-Chunk. Oshkosh is actually Menominee. Oshkosh was the chief of the Menominee people, and it wasn't spelled the way Oshkosh is spelled, but he was a leader among the people, and he was involved in the Treaty of 1825 when they were in Prairie du Chien. And he wears that hat in his photo, Oshkosh. A lot of the people today have revived that again, and so if you go to a powwow, you'll see some of the Oshkosh type hats, and even the women are wearing them too. And I also learned that at the Treaty of 1825, there was one Menominee woman who wore an Oshkosh type hat, and it was so beautiful. But the unfortunate thing is it was part of the treaty negotiations, and that's a really tough time, very political. And when she went back home to Lac du Flambeau, she was killed for her hat by a different tribe, and I won't mention any names. But anyway, then the other thing, Toma's also not a Ho-Chunk word either. And I'm trying to think of where Toma comes from, because there's different stories on where, but somebody said Toma was a chief of the Menominee, but I don't recall reading any Menominee chiefs with names that short. Menominee's names are this long, with lots of, more like Oconomowoc or Waukesha sounding kind of names of the Menominee. So I don't know where Toma came from, but someone posted something on Indigenous Peoples Day on Facebook that said, something about Toma, so I'll have to go back and look. Yeah, the one that I used as an example was Mazomini and Masomini. Madison is Dejob. I'm trying to think of other towns, but off the top of my head, I can't think of anything right now.
There was a boarding school in Toma.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, there was a boarding school there, and they turned it into the VA hospital. So my mother and my father both worked at the VA hospital. First, my father started there as a barber, and then my mother started later on as a nursing assistant. So she worked there until she retired. And so the school still has a student burial ground there, and then some of the barracks were converted into offices, and then they have the VA hospital. And a lot of Ho-Chunk people that live in Toma actually worked there. So they were employed there in different departments. And my first job was at the VA hospital. I worked in the personnel office, so I got to be up there with I don't know what he was called back then, the head of the hospital, the director, and the assistant director, Mr., let's see, Christensen was the director, and I can't remember, Hebel was the assistant director, and the secretary was our neighbor. So right where we live on Mbay Lane, if you go straight up, there's a big farm there, and up the hill, she lived there, and she was the secretary. And I don't know if that was a connection that got me there, but that was my first job, is working at the VA. In the personnel office.
Well, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for coming and to thank Janice. I was so excited to hear her story that I forgot to give you all our land acknowledgement statement, which I would like to take a moment to do now because it's new. We've been working on it for about a year in our Education and Tourism Committee, and our board recently approved it, and we did work with our colleagues at the Ho-Chunk Nation. So I'll read it for you now. The Kickapoo Reserve Management Board acknowledged that the state and federal lands that comprise the reserve fall within the ancestral homelands of First Nation people, including the Ho-Chunk Nation. We recognize the sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk and other First Nations and will work toward a shared future by continuing to create collaborative opportunities to protect and preserve these lands. So many of you know that the Kickapoo Valley Reserve is co-managed with the Ho-Chunk Nation, and we have Ho-Chunk members on our board. So it's a really exciting collaboration, and we're very happy to have Janice here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.